Stories of Impact brings back some of our favorite conversations this season. We'll start with a 5-episode series centered around how citizens can understand and heal polarization and safeguard democracy. First, we bring you What Polarization Teaches Us About Harm and Human Understanding with Dr. Kurt Gray. Welcome to Stories of Impact. In every episode, we travel the world to explore intersections of science and spirituality. I'm your host, writer Tavia Gilbert, and along with journalist Richard Sergey, every first and third Tuesday, we look through a new lens at old traditions, hear from new generations as they dream up innovative solutions, and learn new ways to make sense of modern life. This is Stories of Impact, the art and science of human flourishing. We're back this episode for our second timely interview, focusing on political polarization, wrapping up in conversation with Dr. Kurt Gray, professor of moral psychology and neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill. Moral psychology is the descriptive understanding of our moral judgments, or concern with not just how people should make moral decisions, but how they actually do. As the director of the Deepest Beliefs Lab in the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding, he says,
the work that we do in the lab is much broader and deeper in a sense and gets at all the people's deepest beliefs like religion and perceptions of truth and morality, all the things that people care most about, but are ultimately intangible and invisible. Things that people live and die for, right? Deepest beliefs, but they're in many ways powerfully socially constructed.
Dr. Gray is fascinated by those beliefs. He's in the final year of a 3-year grant designed to test the morality and misperception model of polarization across cultures and contexts. His mission is
to understand our contentious and divided political moment where people are unwilling to discuss politics across the aisle or entertain even that the other side is a reasonable human being in the way that you feel about yourself and your own side. We do disagree already when it comes to politics, but where does this political disagreement come from? And once you get that, then you can kind of understand where this political animosity comes from. But it's really a question of moral disagreement. And for that, you need to understand our moral psychology.
What does he mean by moral conviction? And what does he hope to understand by exploring the origins?
People feel very committed to their moral beliefs. And our work from the lab has suggested that ultimately our moral judgments revolve around understandings of harm, who we see as vulnerable to suffering, who we see as especially likely to be mistreated. And once you make sense of that our moral judgments hinge on our perceptions of harm and vulnerability, then it opens up not only new understanding of morality that helps to unify all sorts of different phenomena, but also a new understanding of political disagreement that really incorporates kind of conceptions of harm and vulnerability into how we think about polarization.
How does the role of harm help us understand political polarization?
Generally, we all agree that premeditated murder is wrong or child abuse is wrong. Obvious examples of intentional harm towards a vulnerable person, like kicking a cat as hard as you can for no reason. Like those things are wrong. We all agree in that, right? Intuitively, viscerally, we agree. But we are ultimately, left to perceive who else might be vulnerable, not just kids, but also fetuses or immigrants or polar bears or God, right? All these things we're left to perceive their minds. So because we can disagree about whether a fetus is vulnerable to harm, right, we can disagree about the morality of abortion. And not only do we disagree about who's vulnerable to harm, we can disagree about what's likely to cause harm. So does the advance of gay rights, does that allow children to have more homes, right? Because gay folks can adopt kids now, or does it lead to the dissolution of the family and therefore harm children? These are the perceptions and assumptions that underlie our moral judgments and ultimately underlie our political disagreement.
Dr. Gray takes an evolutionary approach to harm, going back millennia. Why?
Any theory of our mind, and even the political moment today, requires that we acknowledge that people are part of the chain of evolution. How do we understand our minds today? Well, we have to understand how our minds evolved and where they came from. So this idea of a kind of harm-based moral mind suggests that we're really fixated on who's being harmed and what threats might we face as well. And this makes sense if you think about how we evolved. So we evolved in times when there was a lot of threats. Sometimes those threats were other people. So ancient tribes, there was like a 1 in 50 chance every year you might be murdered by your neighbor because, things were fluid and contentious and dangerous. And even before we formed into tribes, when we roamed the plains as a recently evolved species, there was a 1 in 10 chance that we might be eaten by a predator most years. And so if you think about what it's like to live in those situations, to be hunted, to fear the kind of violence from our conspecifics, you get a pretty interesting picture of the mind when you import that in today. It's not a mind that is a predatory mind, but instead of a prey-based mind. And so when people make their judgments or they make their votes, it's not because they're trying to destroy anything, but because they're worried about protection and that they are trying to mitigate threats and protect themselves from harm.
But aren't humans actually more hunter than hunted?
There's no doubt today that we are apex predators. No other species can hunt wolves from helicopters with high-powered rifles. And I think it's widely agreed that we, as a species, since the advent of stone-tipped spears, are apex predators. So we have caused many extinctions of animals, like the dodo, and all sorts of megafauna. But to understand our minds, you have to go back beyond fairly recent history, where we had stone-tipped spears, to the millions of years that our ancient ancestors all evolved. For most of those millions of years, we were more hunted than hunter. And I think there's some misinterpretation in the anthropological record that gives rise to this misconception that we're more hunter than hunted. For so long, we were concerned about obvious threats that lurk in the forests or in caves, right? Saber-toothed cats or bears. And we might all agree that those things are dangerous and threatening. But when it comes to the world we live in today, where the issues are complex and the things we might be worried about are political policies that affect economic conditions, that affect jobs, which eventually affect our ability to support our family, right? These are complicated things we didn't evolve thinking about, and our minds are ill-equipped to really deeply understand. And so it allows us to have much more wiggle room for our perceptions and narratives that we get from the media or from our religions or from our friends and family, right? There's lots of room to construe new threats. Is raising taxes, is that threatening? Is lowering taxes threatening? These are really complicated issues, and so people can feel very strongly about whether different policies will cause harm and hurt our children. But then once you make those inferences, then you have a strong visceral moral reaction, and then political disagreement results.
How does Dr. Gray understand the deep conflict between liberals and conservatives?
The liberal-conservative divide has often been explained today in terms of, well, liberals have different values than conservatives, and there's some values that liberals will just never understand, but conservatives do, and conservatives might have a kind of advantage because they have a broader moral sense. I think that's not true at all. I think that liberals and conservatives might use different language when discussing moral issues, just like young people use different language than old people do today to talk about things. You get different cultural language mores. But I think our minds, they've been the same for millions of years. And I don't think liberals and conservatives have fundamentally different minds when it comes to our values. Instead, the reason that liberals and conservatives disagree is because baked into those ideologies are different assumptions about who or what is especially vulnerable to victimization or suffering. My research suggests that liberals are more likely to think about victimhood in terms of group-based differences. So what that means is strongly progressive people say, like, well, look, there's some groups of people that are highly vulnerable to mistreatment. They're marginalized people. And some groups of people who are not at all vulnerable to mistreatment. In fact, they're oppressors rather than oppressed. So transgender folks, Muslims, maybe poor African Americans, right? They're kind of marginalized folks, and they're really vulnerable and need to be protected. And then you've got folks like CEOs, police, corporate leaders. There are folks who are not vulnerable, but ultimately oppressors. On the other hand, committed conservatives see everyone as more or less equal when it comes to their vulnerability or their susceptibility to victimization. It doesn't matter if you're born rich or poor. If you're cut, you can still bleed. It doesn't matter if you are white or black. You can still be sad if your children get hurt, if you don't get into college, whatever. And so you get the kind of like Black Lives Matter on progressives, all lives matter on conservatives. You get affirmative action for progressives. You get not affirmative action, right? Everything should be even Steven and up to the kind of hard work of individuals when it comes to conservatives. So you get these very different convictions, but it's ultimately based on perceptions of vulnerability.
How can he help us understand what he means by perceptions of vulnerability?
Early in my career, I really focused on mind perception, how we make sense of the thoughts and feelings of others. And even whether people have thoughts and feelings like you do. You can see the debate today with pets, right? So if you are a dog owner, you might think that your dog has a rich emotional life and can feel things like nostalgia and schadenfreude. But if you are not a dog owner, you might just see a furry animal, a furry robot even, that just eats kibble and poops, right? Very different senses of minds. And in fact, we can look at other people and disagree about the kind of minds that they might have. Is someone who came to the country undocumented immigrant or illegal immigrant, depending on your political leanings, right? Are they really susceptible to suffering? Are they really keenly in pain? Or are they the ones causing pain, right? Are undocumented immigrants hurting American citizens? They're like intentionally bringing drugs up from Mexico. Or are they stuck in internment camps at the border and full of suffering? And so you get these political disagreements based on your understanding of the targets at the center of those disagreements. Are they vulnerable or are they not? Does a fetus suffer pain after 3 weeks, or does it not really have a mind until much later?
How do individuals land on one side or the other of issues with very distinct divides, such as the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter paradigm, or the polarized position between protecting a fetus versus protecting the right to an abortion?
My research has revealed these issues are all ultimately about understandings of harm. And of course, you can go down a level still, which is where those understandings of harm come from. In some ways, I think they're really just baked in to what it means to be a liberal and a conservative. So when you're a conservative, you teach about individualism and even rugged individualism and about your choices and agency, and that's what matters. And maybe if you're more liberal, you teach about context and groups and power structures. I think more research needs to be done about ultimately, well, where do ideologies come from? But what I do know from my work is that baked into these ideologies and driving moral and political disagreement are these understandings of harm. So sometimes people are very much worried about personal harm, but with a lot of these issues, folks are worried about who is most vulnerable in a situation. And the hardest, most contentious issues in our country today are really trade-offs about harm. No one thinks we should just hurt cops. No one thinks that we should just hurt fetuses just because, right? It's always kind of issues of relative harm and relative suffering. So with abortion, you've got a fetus and there's ambiguity or debate about how much a fetus can suffer pain, how much a fetus is a baby versus a dividing mass of cells. And then you've got perceptions of how much women are susceptible to suffering, how much people are harmed if they don't have access to reproductive rights. And so the question of abortion, actually, people agree on abortion mostly, and the disagreement is really about elective abortions around a very narrow age range when it comes to the fetus. Most people think that like the morning after pill is not so terrible and that you shouldn't have a late second trimester abortion. But where we disagree is about maybe a woman doesn't feel ready to have a child because she doesn't have the finances. She's maybe a little further along. And so now there's some discomfort. Who do you prioritize? You prioritize the kind of woman who should make a choice and help her life, and maybe she'll have other children down the road that she'll be a better mother for? Or do you think about the baby that the fetus either is or will be and who that fetus might grow into? And so you get these really different visions of potential vulnerability and who we should protect, whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, but they're motivated by the same impulse of protection from harm.
Does his research help us to bridge the divide?
It certainly understands the divide. And I think within understanding, there's always a pathway to connecting or bridging. And so we've done work looking at how to bridge divides. And when it comes to things like abortion, emphasizing your experiences of suffering, emphasizing your personal concerns about harm. And I think that's where the research really points. And we all understand that it's rational for people to want to avoid suffering because we understand what it's like to be afraid and be threatened. So when people ground their moral convictions in this desire to protect themselves and their family in a personal sense, then we afford them more rationality, we afford them more respect, and we're more willing to interact with them.
The response to the December 2024 killing of the United Healthcare CEO sparked incredible polarization. What does Dr. Gray's research reveal about that?
I think it is really important as a kind of example for our divides today. So going back to the idea of different perceptions of who's vulnerable versus who is a perpetrator. If you're conservative, you say, look, here is someone just doing their job, Brian Thompson. He's got a family. He's like just trying to do his thing. And he was assassinated. And so, murder harms your individual rights, and those are the rights we should respect because we're all fundamentally equal in some powerful way. If people are willing to assassinate anyone who's powerful or anyone who's wealthy, then what does this mean for our society? Then you can't work hard and you can't amass wealth because someone might assassinate you just because of that. But I think progressives, who are generally more a fan of Luigi Mangione, say, look, it is not true that we are equally vulnerable to harm. There are some folks like Brian Thompson who are off and healthy and generally happy, and then his decisions in the name of profit and inequality help make millions of Americans sick and kills folks who can't afford healthcare because they're not well insured. And so I think for liberals, they say, look at this huge collection of people oppressed in the name of corporate success and stakeholder value, then look at Brian Thompson, who's intentionally causing this harm. You get very different intuitions, right, about the morality of that situation. But again, there's like a trade-off of harm. The question is, who's the victim? Who's the perpetrator? Who's the one who's truly suffering here? And who's the one who's inflicting that suffering?
Does his research give us insight into making a decision about which side is more valid? Or does it just point out the divide?
For the most contentious issues, there's the fact that half the people agree on one side and half the people agree on the other means that it's probably difficult to find an objective answer here. Again, people would agree about the wrongness of just killing someone on the street and the wrongness of, denying sick people medical coverage. People generally think that both those things are bad, but when you put them in competition with each other, you get intuitions that go each way because it's a hot button moral trade-off. So my work does not suggest moral truth. That's a question for philosophers or preachers, but my work reveals what's the nature of this agreement. And then ultimately, questions of bridging divide, it also reveals how to have conversations to see what the other person sees.
Social media, cable news, the bubbles that each side lives in, how do they impact moral decision-making?
The platforms themselves amplify outrage. Their incentives as for-profit companies are to capture our attention and keep us scrolling and keep us engaged. And we know what keeps us engaged and keep us yelling at others. And that's outrage, and that's fear, and that's threats. And so social media really brings out the worst in people, at least the platforms as they're made now. They're particularly good at inciting moral panics. There's always been moral panics where people are terrified of threats, destroying communities and hurting our children. But social media allows moral panics to form and spread so quickly and so efficiently that we're almost constantly in moral panics today. Every day there's a new issue that we can be terrified about. And the reason social media is so good is because it takes these threats, it elevates them so we all see them, and then it has virality metrics so you can see how many other people are worried about those threats. And then the platforms really highlight which threats are going most viral. And the only way to combat those things, because you can't run away from threats on social media, is to express your outrage as a way to shut down the people who are doing terrible things, getting angry. But it turns out you getting angry gets other people angry, and then they see you as a threat, right? So you log in and you see screaming people running towards you and the sound of distant roars like a Godzilla movie. Here's this terrible threat, and everyone's terrified, and you should be terrified too.
Dr. Gray's 2025 book is called Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics, and How to Find Common Ground.
It's a universal emotion in today's political moment. So many people are outraged at what people are doing or what people are not doing. And I wanted to speak to these powerful feelings of outrage. And I think, again, it's kind of feelings of outrage come from our moral condemnation, and our moral condemnation ultimately comes from concerns about harm. And so at the end, it really deeply connects to this thesis that I've been working on that's highlighted in the book about our harm-based moral minds. And when we see harm, as we so often do in today's society, we get outraged.
So how do we stop being outraged, and how do we start to bridge these divides? Can we bridge these divides?
I'm an optimist. I think we can bridge the divides. I think there are many people who are trying their best to bridge divides, creating really innovative solutions, whether new social media platforms or grassroots campaigns to connect people within communities, like over food or over volunteering. We've asked people, what's the best way you think to bridge divides when it comes to political disagreement? They would tell you, I want the facts, give me the facts, and that's what's going to make me have better conversations with people who think differently about politics. And this is why it's important to do the science, because facts aren't the best way to bridge divides, right? It turns out that rather than facts, what helps people connect across differences are sharing personal experiences, right? Personal stories, especially those revolving around feelings of vulnerability, feelings of victimhood, and stories designed to help people understand and not gotcha. They're not about persuading as much as sharing. And our work shows that when you approach conversations with this kind of idea of understanding, and lots of other folks look at like deep listening is another way to bridge divides. These tools really help us connect across the divide that is not only political, but also the divide that exists between all different minds, different thoughts, different feelings. It is possible to bridge these divides, and we're uncovering, along with other folks, ways to better bridge.
Does he have a good example of how bridging divides can work in practice?
We recruited people on campus, passersby one summer, to have conversations about politics with an undergraduate research assistant. She's wandering around. We sit her down. We say, would you like to have a conversation with a UNC student? She'll say, sure. Great, it's about guns. All right. And what's your view on guns? And she'll say, I'm pro-gun control. And then the student will say, look, well, I'm pro-gun rights, and here's why. And anyone who thinks otherwise is un-American. So we wanted to have some division, some heat, some excitement here. And then our accomplice says, the reason that I'm pro-gun rights is because here's a stat about how many times people use guns to defend themselves in America every year, like hundreds of thousands of people every year. Or here's a story. One time when I was a kid, my mom used a gun to defend our family from a home invader. Just one anecdote, but it turns out that when we evaluated those conversations, we had a team code those conversations for civility and respect. The conversations with a story were much more civil. People were treated as much more rational than when you talked about facts. We looked on social media, we've looked on op-eds in the New York Times, we looked on cable news like CNN or Fox News. It's almost always the case that when someone talks about their personal experiences when it comes to political disagreement, they are treated as more rational and given more respect.
What are Dr. Gray's thoughts about stories like the disinformation from the current administration about immigrants eating dogs and cats? A story not based in fact, but consumed by millions and millions of people.
That's not bridging divides, right? That's inciting them. So I think it's certainly true that political actors have long known that stories are powerful ways to foment outrage and drive division. I think we've known that for a long time. But I think the good folks who are trying to bridge those divides perhaps didn't realize the power of stories to bring people together. And so I think stories are a powerful way to foster disconnection, even though that story is not true. And stories are also a powerful way to foster connection. And stories alone are not sufficient to move us forward as a country or as the world. We need stories to initially allow people to sit down with each other and respect each other enough to have conversations about the facts. So I think if you're trying to undo the damage of the kind of misinformation or intense disagreement, sometimes fomented by stories, you still need stories to allow people to sit down and start talking about what is true.
Is Dr. Gray's prescription a one-on-one solution, or is it scalable?
Mostly I've focused on one-on-one in the sense that groups and societies are ultimately collections of individuals who have conversations with each other. And certainly in terms of like families and workplaces, there's a really important role for these individual conversations and bringing people back together. Once you've brought back families and workplaces and communities, then people are at a place where they feel more secure and confident so that they can have conversations with other folks, right? We have other work showing that when people belong to these dense personal networks or groups of friends know each other and they're all together, they have more hope for the future of the country and are more willing to engage with more distant political opponents. So I do think it's really important to have these kind of connections at a local level. At the same time, I understand that it's important to be able to find scalable solutions. And there are social media platforms that really are beginning to think about how can we make our interactions online not just angry 140 or 60 character screams at perfect strangers that help us get likes and get shared by the algorithm. There's social media platforms that let's encourage people to not be anonymous, to build community, to focus on things that we need to focus on to live our lives more successfully. I do think that there are scalable solutions out there. And even the individual stories, there are ways to allow more of those things to happen, have bigger exchanges, set up our network so that there's more kind of exchange of opinions and perspectives. But at the end of the day, I do think that ultimately interpersonal connection is important.
But in the era of the internet, misinformation and disinformation can make their way around the planet in a nanosecond and are now accelerated by AI. So what gives him hope?
I think it's easy to be pessimistic. At the same time, I think we are in a better place as a world than we were 100 years ago. And I think socially, we're in a better place than we were hundreds of years ago. There's less violence. People are healthier. People are happier. If you had to pick an era in which to be born in terms of medicine, in terms of what we know in science, I think you'd still pick the modern era. And there's no doubt that misinformation is an important problem. But I think people are not as stupid as we think, right? People are generally pretty rational. And when people are making decisions, especially in the long term, they are generally trying to make the best decisions for themselves and their families. And of course, psychology has revealed that we fail that kind of rationality test in many different ways. But I think as a whole, humans have done pretty well as a species. And I think there's lots of good things that the internet does as well. But there's no doubt we need ways to understand misinformation. But I think most people are not flat earthers. I think most people are not drinking bleach during COVID. Even if we talk about these examples, most people are not enacting behaviors that are fundamentally stupid, that are not fundamentally irrational.
What research results have surprised Dr. Gray?
On one hand, what wasn't surprising is that these conceptions of victimhood and perceptions of threat are really important and in some ways stronger than we thought. So I guess it's surprising to be as right as we thought we were. But there's also surprises in the sense of we thought initially that maybe people weren't aware that others were thinking about concerns about harm. But people are aware that folks on the other side are concerned about harm. They're not blind to the perceptions of harm that other people are seeing. Instead, they're just fundamentally denying that harm. I know you see that fetuses are vulnerable to harm. I do appreciate that, but I think you're just wrong in your assumption of that. And so that suggests that it's a different way to bridge them. It's not just correcting misconceptions, although those can be very important in many ways. So you can correct the misconception that other people on the other side don't hate you as much as you think. And I think that decreases animosity towards the other side. If you're like, look, this other side, they actually don't hate you. They don't hate how you live. They don't hate who you are. And then that's great. You're like, oh, great. Now I hate them less because I don't feel like they hate me. But it turns out that there's not a misconception that the other side is grounding their judgments in harm for a lot of these issues. You understand, right? The other side says, I don't want to kill babies. And the other side says, I don't want to hurt women. But you just deny what hurts women or hurts babies. So it's going to require us to pivot, I think, when it comes to the intervention, to really appreciate that it's about denial of who the true victim is and not just blindness to that.
What would he say to a friend or neighbor who says, I hate that other person because they voted for fill in the blank?
I say, do you know folks who vote them and having a conversation with them for why they voted that particular way? My own personal experiences and that of my friends and family, if you actually talk to someone who votes a certain way and try to ask them, what in your life led you to do this? What are your perceptions and assumptions that led you to do this? People come away from those conversations surprised at how rational the other person is. There's this idea that the other side is evil because they're intentionally trying to burn it all down, or they're stupid because they don't understand what's actually causing harm. But if you talk to them and you realize they're actually trying to protect themselves, they actually have a reasonable set of assumptions about how the world works, then I feel like it's harder to be angry at them after having those conversations. So usually when I talk to someone who gets angry, I try to not only share with them the science of why we're disagreeing, but also encourage them to have conversations with people. Because after those conversations, you think, oh, this is why they think this. This is why they think that the policies of this person or this person are also going to help America and their families.
One of his conclusions is around moral humility. What does that mean?
Religions have been discussing the importance of humility for millennia. And there's been a recent push by funders to look at intellectual humility. And I think that's important. To think about the way I think about things might not always be the right way to think about things. But I think it's even harder and more important in today's moment to have moral humility, which is the ability to still hold fast to your convictions, but ultimately recognize that perhaps you might be able to learn something from someone who disagrees with you when it comes to morality, that you might not have the total picture in your mind about moral issues. I was on a panel talking with someone who grew up in the South. We were talking about taxes. And, I grew up in Canada. Taxes are much higher in Canada. And my thought for why we need higher taxes is people don't appreciate that most people want less inequality in the world. Even Americans who vote Republican generally want less inequality than exists in America today. But she brought up this really great point, which is, look, the people that she grew up with, they just didn't trust the government to correctly spend that money. And there's lots of examples of the government doing bad things or just short-sighted or misguided that could perhaps hurt people. And so her opposition to taxes wasn't that it was only to reduce inequality, which it is, but it's also a mechanism to give the government your money to make decisions with. And she thought that government was ill-positioned to correctly make those decisions. And I didn't appreciate that. It made me really think about moral humility of, oh, wow, I thought I knew about taxes, but the issue is more complicated than I considered.
Can he connect his work in polarization to human flourishing?
I think it's easy to do. Flourishing requires that we have healthy social networks. We feel connected to our communities. We feel confident in where our country's going. We feel trust in our government. And polarization undermines all of those things. And in addressing polarization and really understanding, why are we divided? What are the roots of these things? By understanding scientifically, we have a model of how our minds work and how society works. Then we can better understand how to fix this kind of polarization and how to equip people with the skills to better flourish, to have those relationships they've lost, to feel the sense of trust that we've lost in our government, to feel the kind of confidence in our communities. So I think it's very easy to connect.
What drives Dr. Gray's work? What interests him so much about this?
Anyone who wants flourishing for myself, my family, my community, and my country, I want to figure out why we're divided and how to fix it. I think intellectually, I'm also interested in how our minds work and how to bridge the gap between one mind and another. I mean, the problem of other minds is something that has been recognized as a problem for hundreds of years. How do we make sense of what other people are thinking? Is your pain the same as my pain? How do we really understand other people? And I think this desire for understanding is so interesting intellectually, but also so important for flourishing. At the end of the day, if we can understand who people are and where they're coming from and why they act the way they do, would not only be so important for solving so many social problems, but would also allow us to move through the world better as human beings.
The world is moving at light speed, and at times we feel as overwhelmed by it as we suspect you do. But the conversations we have on the Stories of Impact podcast not only help us better understand the world around us, but ground us and help us cultivate a spirit of curiosity, hope, and connection. I hope that these two conversations on polarization have done that for you too, and that every episode offers you something that makes you feel a little bit better about this complicated experience of life. We hope you'll come back in 2 weeks for another new and inspiring episode. In the meantime, please help us make an impact and share the Stories of Impact podcast. You can get in touch at storiesofimpact.org. This has been the Stories of Impact podcast with an interview by Richard Sergey, written and produced by Tavia Gilbert for Talkbox Productions, assistant producer Oscar Falk, music by Alexander Filipiak, mix and master by Kayla Elrod, executive producer Michelle Cobb. The Stories of Impact podcast is generously supported by Templeton World Charity Foundation.